your questions. So, thanks for coming on Friday afternoon, Valentine's Day, and thanks for the invitation, Pablo, to speak with you about this theme. It's not an easy one. I'm going to contribute some thoughts on it, and I'll look forward to questions and discussion. So, about 120 years ago, John Acton, an English Catholic contemporary and friend of John Henry Newman, stated that if the past has been an obstacle and a burden, knowledge of the past is the safest and surest emancipation. Reconciliation requires knowledge of a negative past and its legacy, with which we must still come to terms. It also requires, in our Canadian context, awareness of the hope, courage, and humility with which many Indigenous and non-Indigenous people have sought to redress the burden of the past, which weighs most heavily on Indigenous peoples. Envisioning a reconciled Canada, however, and cultivating the next generation of Indigenous and non-Indigenous leaders capable of co-creating that Canada, also requires a historical critique that is both penetrating and nuanced. And that is a very difficult task. In other words, as we dig deeper into what went wrong, we must be careful not to lose sight of what went right. We must be careful not to reduce any people, history, or culture to its worst aspects or failings. Otherwise, on what basis can we hope for reconciliation, except a naive assumption that we are better than those who came before us, or who weigh in differently on the scale of intersectionality and wokeness? Around this time last year, I collaborated with the Newman Center to organize a talk by Alexandre Havard on virtuous leadership, a theme he has addressed in several books and at least 5 continents. The idea for Havard's book originated in university lectures he was giving on European law. His students wanted to know how the founders of the European Union were able to overcome the divisions created by the world wars. Why and how did these leaders envision unity and reconciliation when so many around them saw any such project as treasonous collaboration with enemy nations? So Havard began examining the work and thought of people like Robert Schuman, Konrad Adenauer, Alcide de Gasperi. And what he found led to his book on virtuous leadership, where he defined magnanimity, greatness of soul, as the virtue proper to leadership. The quest for greatness in oneself and in others, coupled with the humility that acknowledges that any talents we have are gifts received in order to develop, not primarily to serve ourselves, but others. Such humble magnanimity also entails awareness of the tremendous gifts received by others, which we depend on, and that the greatest service we can give to anyone is to help them flourish, to discover and develop their gifts, and put them at the service of others as well. As Havard emphasizes, such leadership is not founded on or limited to any particular position or personality. It is a way of being, a path of virtue and character open to all. Ultimately, the founders of the European Union, many of them devout Catholics, understood that reconciliation between peoples could only be built on a commitment to see, emphasize, and cultivate what is best in each other, while not being blind to our common capacity for evil. Such a commitment is never easy, either for victims or for those who wish to distance themselves from perpetrators, real or alleged. However, such a commitment to cultivate the habit or virtue of magnanimity is rendered very difficult if our critique of what went wrong buries any examples of what was right. And it becomes even more difficult, if not impossible, if our critique of what went wrong buries our awareness of our shared humanity. This last point may seem self-evident, but I found it necessary to make it the subtle or implicit focus of much of my teaching in history and Indigenous studies, in secular and religious contexts alike. The most important insight that some of my students refer to coming out of my classes, regardless of their culture or background, seems to be a deeper awareness, a deeper appreciation of our shared humanity, our shared capacity to aspire to high ideals, to truth, beauty, and goodness, our shared experience of the struggles necessary to live up to any ideals worth holding, our shared capacity to fail, and the shared difficulty of disentangling such ideals from attempts, our own and others, to control truth, beauty, and goodness themselves, often so as to avoid their call to conversion in action. If such a sense of shared humanity is a critical insight, even for some students leading to a paradigm shift, what does this say about the message implicit and even explicit in much of what they are hearing today in some university contexts? What does it say about some of the calls to conversion in action that they are hearing in many secular and religious contexts? Here is the most fundamental point I wish to emphasize this evening. No call to conversion or action, no penetrating historical critique can bring about reconciliation if it does not foster deep awareness of our shared humanity, our shared capacity not only for evil, but above all, our shared capacity for good. When I first heard Hubbard's ideas on magnanimity 10 years ago, the examples that immediately came to mind were from the context of my home community of Moose Factory in Nomoshkego-Aski, James Bay Cree Territory. A youth leadership program known as the YMCA Leaders Corps, as well as traditional Cree leadership teachings and role models. Above all, I thought of John Delaney, an Irish-Canadian teacher who founded and ran the Leaders Program, and his EU Cree wife, Grace Visitor. They were models of leadership from different traditions, but also models of a marriage and reconciliation of leadership principles and ideals that these traditions have in common. Before elaborating on this, however, I want to look at two examples of calls to conversion in action, starting with one that dates back to the time when John and Grace met, some 50 years ago. Let's go there now, to the summer of 1969. It's a time of international Cold War and of many calls for conversion, change, revolution, reform. Just 1 year earlier, on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain, in Prague and in Paris, very distinct protest movements sought to remove obstacles to authentic freedom and human flourishing, highlighting how our quests for human authenticity are deeply entangled in quests and contests for power, or the very meaning of human authenticity, legitimate authority, and authorship of human nature. In Canada, at the same time, a new Prime Minister has been elected on a promise to create a just society. And less than a year into his mandate, Pierre Trudeau has released a major policy initiative aimed at including Indigenous peoples in this vision. Known today as the White Paper, the new policy proposes to abolish the Indian Act and Indian status, so as to give Indigenous people equal status with all other Canadian citizens. It will quickly be rejected as another attempt to assimilate Indigenous individuals rather than honor the treaties and make space for Indigenous peoples and their relationships to each other and their lands. As part of his reforms, Trudeau has imposed federal control over the administration of all Indian residential schools. Father Yvon Levac, an oblate missionary priest with many years' experience working in these schools, is about to give an opening address at a workshop in Saskatoon for Catholic staff who continue to work in residences for Indigenous students. We'll listen in now on his speech. It's an abridged quote here, because it's 4 pages long. Let me read the whole thing. Friends, this past week, our great responsibility has been brought home to me so forcibly that I have decided to forego the usual words of welcome and instead hold up a mirror to let you see something you won't like and ask you questions that have to be answered. Unfortunately, accounts of mistreatment, deprivation of basic human rights, the right to speak the native language, for example, and other complaints, justified or not, are being broadcast from coast to coast, and the churches responsible for the residences are denounced and discredited. It is not the time to refute accusations or critique the biased manner in which well-known personages are using the Indian. I want to quote verbatim an Indian interviewed last week who lamented that their children were still being taught by white teachers that still have their fixed judgments and know nothing of Indians or Indian children. Whether this kind of blanket condemnation is valid or not, it is being made and it touches you directly. You are entrusted with the care of Indian children. It has been said that the church and government systematically scheme to snatch children from their parents. If what has been done in the past resulted in alienation of children from their homes, this indeed is far from the church's declared goal in the education of Indian children. It is our aim to assist the children who, for economic reasons, broken homes, geography, or whatever, are placed in the residences or hostels to achieve the maximum personal development possible. If, for the last generation, that goal has not been attained, we must examine the reasons why the adult Indians today are dissatisfied and drastically change the climate of our residences and the relationship of staff with the children. And now, I ask, how much do you know about Indians and Indian children? The Indians resent our indifference to their values, our disdain for their way of life, our ignorance of their traditions and language. In all of my experience as a missionary and principal, I have found that they want only what you and I want: genuine interest, not morbid curiosity; willing brotherhood, not suspicious mistrust; understanding acceptance, not a condescending, disparaging criticism. Work with simplicity, real concern for these children as human beings, and real interest in their ideas and ways of life. Get to know each child, his family, his language. Sit down humbly and swap vocabulary. Be willing to stumble over difficult sounds, get laughed at and corrected. Learn the language of the people you are with. It isn't reproducing sounds that counts. It is the willingness to share the lives of other people, the assurance that they have something of value that another human being esteems and wants to share. We assume that we are right, that our way is better because we are white, educated, and members of the dominant society. Right here and now, purge your mind of this cancer. You can only be superior by your sensitivity to the feelings, needs, and aspirations of other people. We criticize foreigners who come to Canada and would not learn our language or ways. That is how the Indian feels. Show him, I beg you, the respect and esteem of at least trying to learn some of his language. And he closes with this paragraph. The Indian and the white man are two distinct parts of the just society which must work together and interpenetrate with reciprocal aid. Therefore, it is not only the white man who must help the Indian, but also the Indian who must help the white man. In this critical moment of Canadian history, the assistance of the Indian has become of paramount necessity for all of us. Up till now, the evolution of Canadian society has come about solely around the wish of the white man, never with the wish of the Indian. Thus, the figure of the Indian has remained outside of our mind as we have built up our modern society. And because of this, our progress may be compared to that of a man trying to advance on one leg instead of two. Father Novak's speech is hard-hitting and revealing. It shows that prejudices, ignorance, and indifference were widespread, not only in Canadian society, but also in the church. Yet it also shows that many had a deep love of Indigenous peoples and a profound conviction that they had something indispensable to offer to the church and the country. And Father Novak was not a marginal voice. He was director of the Oblate Indian and Eskimo Council, the most prominent Catholic organization dedicated to Indigenous education. 50 years later, Father Novak's speech still resonates amidst change and continuity. Today, there are many efforts to critique and uproot past errors, to reconcile, and to ensure that Indigenous peoples, perspectives, and cultures are no longer marginalized or belittled in lands that they have called home since time beyond memory. Indigenization has become a priority agenda item in political, scholarly, cultural, ecclesial, and other circles. Discussion of the Indian problem has been displaced by discussion of the Canada problem, the settler problem, the white privilege problem, the church problem. All this echoes, to some degree, Father Novak's provocative call to look inward, to discover and uproot defects too often projected on others, and his sharp criticism of a nation and a church trying to advance on one leg without the input and assistance of Indigenous peoples in their own land. Attitudes have shifted tremendously over the last half century, and this can neither be dismissed as political correctness nor naively attributed to moral superiority over our predecessors. The change stems primarily from a dramatic decrease in the imbalance of power. John Ralston Saul describes this shift in his 2014 book, The Comeback. Aboriginal peoples, he writes, have been making a remarkable comeback from a terrifyingly low point of population of legal respect, of civilizational stability, a comeback to a position of power, influence, and civilizational creativity. Comeback highlights the fact that the situation deplored by Father Levac in 1969 was not always this way. And if we had time, I would explore this more. Even at their demographic nadir, however, Indigenous peoples have never ceased to be the majority in the majority of Canadian territory, the resources of which Canada depends so heavily on for its economic prosperity. Today, with the highest birth rates in the country, Indigenous peoples are making their presence felt once again on many fronts, demographically, politically, culturally, legally, economically, etc., revealing tremendous resilience and successes, but also exacerbating and magnifying unresolved challenges. In 2013, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute published 2 reports with 2 visions of the present and future. One report focused on a growing contingent of increasingly disenfranchised and radicalized Indigenous youth who could easily disrupt the Canadian economy and more. The second report focused on an equally significant and growing contingent of well-educated Indigenous youth, leaders, and entrepreneurs who are helping build a Canada that, as Father Levac would put it, walks on 2 legs rather than one. Nevertheless, some remain skeptical that the Indigenous leg can be anything more than a prosthetic limb. In many quarters, there's also growing resistance to implicit or explicit calls or demands for conversion. This skepticism and resistance cannot be reduced to racism and prejudice, which certainly persists, or to the fact that education and reconciliation efforts lag behind the increasing exposure of non-Indigenous Canadians to Indigenous perspectives, presence, and influence with regard to matters of common concern and impact. This education gap, for example, makes it difficult for non-Indigenous Canadians to distinguish between Indigenous cultures in renewal, involving fragile archaeological and intergenerational reconstruction in the wake of destructive policies of coercive assimilation, versus thriving Indigenous cultures, whose relevance and richness transcends their cultural boundaries and speaks to all of us about what it means to be human. Education, therefore, is clearly critical, but 50 years ago, people with good intentions needed to ask how they might be getting Indigenous education and childcare wrong, and how their intentions and attitudes might need purification and conversion. Today, therefore, regardless of our good intentions, we still need to ask how we might be getting education, self-examination, reconciliation, indigenization wrong. And we might need to reflect on how our intentions and attitudes might themselves need conversion. As Father Levac points out in his talk, some people were intervening for less than altruistic motives, to place themselves on the right side of history, to promote their own agenda, or to discredit the church, for example. This tendency has not changed. Ultimately, we need to reflect on how our calls to conversion might themselves need conversion. By we, I mean Canada, other nations, the church, you and I, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, Catholic and non-Catholic, religious, secular, etc. By way of example, I want to look at one of the most widespread religious and secular reconciliation exercises in Canada, known as the blanket exercise. Created in the 1990s by Kairos, a Canadian Christian ecumenical organization that includes Catholics, this exercise is also widely used in secular contexts. One of my former students just participated in it as a required part of Dalhousie University's law program. My assessment, which follows, is based on my own experience of the exercise in a university context several years ago, as well as informal interviews with others who have followed it. In my particular case, the exercise began with an elder presenting an accurate and moving account of the most beautiful spiritual ideals of the Mi'kmaq people, on whose traditional territory the host university was located. Then, with blankets spread out on the floor to represent pre-contact North America, an account was given of non-Indigenous actions or inactions that had negatively impacted Indigenous peoples. As the narrative unfolded, almost all the blankets were removed to represent the loss of Indigenous territory and life. Aside from minor issues, the account was accurate. In the final part of the exercise, participants were given the opportunity to speak about what they felt. The emotional tension was high. Some participants expressed shock, anger, discomfort, guilt. Some wanted to learn more, take action. Others remained silent, This exercise was and remains a powerful and well-intentioned call to conversion and action. But, in my view, it is missing a critical component. What the exercise lacks is a final part in which the leaders make the following points clear about the exercise. First, the best ideals of a particular Indigenous culture were juxtaposed with a narrative that implicitly reduced the history of non-Indigenous actions and inactions to their worst aspects, and also generalized those across all non-Indigenous peoples without nuance or context. Second, this contrast between the best of Mi'kmaq ideals and the worst of European actions and inactions was stark, but the implicit comparison created a very clear line between victims and perpetrators of injustice, leaving little room for those whose mixed ancestry defies easy categorization or identification with either side. Third, non-Indigenous peoples found themselves in the same situation that many Indigenous peoples have previously found themselves in, where their worst shortcomings, real or perceived, were juxtaposed with the very best of non-Indigenous ideals or successes, and where they have been manipulated to feel inferior for being Indigenous. None of these points were made explicit or discussed in the blanket exercise. And in my view, the exercise should have concluded with a guided discussion aimed at identifying common ideals in Indigenous and non-Indigenous cultures, the lessons from the shared experience of the challenge of trying to live up to such ideals, pre- and post-contact, and the actions that all can take towards reconciliation and reparation. Without the addition of that part, the blanket exercise risks doing as much harm as good. And I see this in the anecdotal evidence, my own experience, speaking to others about it. What happens when non-Indigenous participants come to the realization sooner or later that they were intellectually and emotionally manipulated to adopt a feeling of white guilt or a position of vicarious perpetrator? Will they retain the valid points when they realize the gap that also exists between Indigenous ideals and practice, and which predates colonialism or the arrival of Europeans? How does this not increase the deficit victim paradigm with which Indigenous peoples are too often portrayed? How does it not fuel the competing and polarizing reductive explanations of that deficit? One of which blames only Indigenous peoples, the other only non-Indigenous peoples and governments. What good can non-Indigenous people do if they're to operate from a sense of white guilt, moral inferiority, radical cultural difference, or a romanticized view of Indigenous peoples? How can they avoid the temptation to try to situate themselves on the right side of history, or to find a scapegoat? And in that regard, the Church in many ways is a perfect candidate. How will the implicit message impact Indigenous youth, who are told in this way that their ideals and values are something inherent, rather than things that require constant struggle to maintain and live? How will this not increase skepticism and resistance, especially if legitimate concerns are dismissed as mere racism? How will this not provoke reactions that fuel ongoing racism, prejudice, and misunderstanding? I referred to the Church just now as one example of a scapegoat. It is seen as different. It has sufficient responsibility and is sufficiently powerful to be a meaningful scapegoat, but vulnerable enough that it cannot easily defend itself. Criteria put out by René Girard. We can stop for a moment and consider the sexual abuse crisis and how the Church is portrayed in that context. Scapegoating is a shortcut to reconciliation that doesn't achieve reconciliation in the end. This is an issue that many Catholics are sensitive to, but we have to be careful to distinguish between scapegoating and a very legitimate critique of the Church's entanglement in colonialism. In this regard, Father Levac pointed in a very good direction and provided a good example. He did not respond defensively. Neither did he ignore the biases and the criticism or the gap between the perceived legacy of the Church and its real legacy, as messy as that may be. Father Levac's response, by his value then and now, shows that far more important than counter-narrative is our way of being and relating. Father Levac also pointed to all the key principles of Catholic social teaching: the common good, solidarity, subsidiarity, the importance of parents, the role of Indigenous peoples in resolving their own affairs, in resolving and governing their own affairs, human dignity, etc. Because these principles, of course, are part of Catholic social teaching, doesn't mean that the Church claims ownership over them. On the contrary, these principles find echo in other cultures and are often lived much better by others. In my view and experience, adherence or not to the principles of Catholic social teaching has made the difference between good and poor relations between the Church and Indigenous peoples in particular times and places. Father Levac sums up these principles best in his reference to walking on two legs. We need to reflect not only about what non-Indigenous people can do for Indigenous peoples. Much harm has been done because of the assumptions of superiority embedded in that approach, but also about the need we have for each other as Indigenous and non-Indigenous, Catholic and non-Catholic. This was one of the points raised by Catholic representatives in the post-war Joint Committee hearings on the Indian Act. It was the first time the Indian Act was scrutinized to this degree, and it was the first time that Indigenous peoples in Canada spoke to leaders in government on this scale, just after the Second World War. And there were many groups that presented to this Joint Committee, and it's interesting to see one of the Catholic organizations spoke about the need for Canadians to see acculturation as a two-way street. In other words, we're non-Indigenous to learn about Indigenous peoples, to become acculturated to Indigenous peoples as well. Likewise, for those of us who are Catholics, it is not merely a matter of applying Catholic social teaching, but of drawing on the strengths of Indigenous experiences and cultures in order to enrich the understanding and practice of Catholic social teaching. This is itself entirely consistent with the principles of common good, human dignity, solidarity, and subsidiarity, of walking on two legs. Father Yvonne Levac's words resonate profoundly with me, and they have been echoed in other terms by Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, who points out in Truth and Tolerance, Christianity and World Religions, that Christians should see in the encounter with non-Christian cultures an opportunity to penetrate more deeply into the truth about what it means to be human, even about our own faith. Pre-Catholic elder Raphael Wabino replied the same when he suggested in the 1970s that what his community needed was a cultural center where the best of Southern and Northern cultures and values could be brought together. As an aside, his wife, Margaret Wabino, was in the inner circle in the House of Commons at the age of 103 or so when Prime Minister Harper delivered his Indian residential school apology. And despite having attended residential school, she had to have the apology translated into Cree because she'd been educated in her own language. Indigenous knowledge systems, histories, and cultures are important not only for Indigenous peoples, but because they have something unique and profound to say to the wider world about what it means to be human. My conviction in that regard is not founded on allegiance to political or academic currents or theories. It is founded on lived experience. As a Catholic non-Cree born and raised in the Cree community of Moose Factory, I've spent most of my life studying Cree and Indigenous cultures and trying to bring them into deeper dialogue with Christian and Western cultures. I'm not carving out an original path in this way. I'm merely following the example of elders and mentors in James Bay, such as Margaret and Raphael Wabino. Many of my teachers and models of Christianity, for example, have been Cree, some of them non-Christian. But first and foremost, they've been models of humanity. I want to turn my attention shortly to the Moose Factory YMCA Leaders Corps and its impact within my home community and elsewhere in James Bay. But first, just a few words on the context of Moose Factory and on traditional Cree leadership principles as well. So as a permanent settlement originating in the fur trade, Moose Factory is going to celebrate 350 years in 2023. But the history of those who live there is, of course, much broader and deeper. In some ways, Moose Factory is a microcosm of Canada, but in different proportions. When we zoom in on Moose Factory and nearby Moosonee, in the deep south of the Arctic Ocean, we find overlapping and sometimes competing Indigenous identities that come into focus. Some of the Crees who live here have their traditional hunting grounds in the Moose River watershed. Others come from different regions of James Bay and speak distinct dialects of Cree. Few of them are not without some admixture of European ancestry. Others are identified by it, or have been at some point, being known as half-breeds or Métis. The majority of them now have Indian status. Finally, some have no Cree ancestry, but may be Indigenous or intermarried with Crees. In the end, few people and relationships fit neatly on either side of various divisions that are too often emphasized. These divisions include original Moose Cree members versus transferees from other Omishkego or EU First Nations. Quebec, EU Cree versus Ontario Omishkego Cree. Moose Cree First Nation, Omishkego, versus Mo-Quebec Council of the Cree Nation, EUs of Quebec. L dialect versus Y dialect or N dialect Cree. And status versus regained status, Bill C-31, versus non-status. In this community, it quickly becomes clear that many of the primary challenges of reconciliation, resurgence, and decolonization do not fall neatly along the lines of Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations as typically defined. In the late 1990s, consultation with elders, leaders, and educators in Moose Factory led to my MA thesis on a 19th century conflict known locally as the Hanabe Massacre. Misinterpretations of that event were feeding into divisive local politics. Later, after starting my PhD, I helped co-found a tri-jurisdictional and grassroots heritage and hospitality association with the motto, "Building a Future with Our Shared Past." That association has faced the challenge of overcoming a resurgent politics of difference that emphasizes divisions instead of the commonalities and relationships among those who call the region home. But these differences are not so strong as what binds people together. And one of the strongest commonalities that unites the people of Moose Factory and James Bay is an ethic of reciprocity. This emphasis on relationship and hospitality relies on epistemic integrity and prudence, careful discernment of reality, be it the thickness of river ice or the intentions of a newcomer. It is also founded on self-governance or self-control, which can make the difference between life and death in an unforgiving subarctic environment. Yet, as Cree elder Louis Bird insists, traditional stories repeatedly warn against failures to follow this ethic. Historically in the subarctic, interdependence with human and other than human persons has often forced stark choices between this ethic and its perversion or inversion. Manipulative and extremely individualistic, this contrary ethic does not hesitate to reduce truth and others to mere objects of power in the pursuit of narrow self-interest. Traditionally, the antithesis of the ideal upama, leader or elder, is the person who is so power-hungry that he or she transforms into a cannibal Wendigo. These themes were central to my doctoral thesis in Indigenous intellectual, cultural, and religious history, which studied the Witigo concept as a photographic negative of Cree philosophical anthropology and ethics, tracing their evolution over time in relation to European influences, actions, ideas, and ideals. What I discovered in Cree and European and Euro-Canadian encounters with the Witigo and with each other was not radical cultural difference, but profound common ground on the edge of humanity. Even amidst conflict and misunderstanding, even if expressed in different ways across cultural time or space, there was a shared conviction that reducing truth or others to mere objects in quests or contests for power was to risk losing one's humanity. Witigo possession or transformation may be almost unheard of today, but this extreme negation of Cree leadership principles and ideals remains a metaphor and guidepost for critiquing failures to adhere to the ethic of reciprocity. To state it more positively, Cree leadership principles and ideals remain foundational to the success of one of the strongest Indigenous nations in Canada, the Cree Nation of Iuishchi, in present-day Quebec. These principles and ideals also resonate powerfully for the Mushkegowuk of present-day Ontario, even if a different treaty relationship, history, and context have sometimes created greater external and internal obstacles to their implementation. The Moose Factory YMCA Leaders Corps is another powerful example of common ground and interrelationship that epitomizes an ethic of reciprocity and transcends the kinds of divisions outlined above. This leadership program, entirely volunteer-driven, was founded in 1967 as an extension of the Midland YMCA. Although it ran primarily in Moose Factory, it also had participants from other communities nearby and through local residential schools, other James Bay communities. A branch was also run in Fort George, present-day Chesapeake, northern Quebec, in the early 1970s. As noted earlier, the person who defined the ethos of the program through the majority of its first 50 years was John Delaney. Mr. D, as so many of us came to call him, arrived in Moose Factory in the late 1960s as an 18-year-old Indian residential day school teacher, and eventually retired from the provincial public school system years later. He married Grace Visitor, a Niu Cree woman who also strongly influenced the program and remains a recognized leader in her own right. With the exception of a few years in Fort George, they lived together in Moose Factory until John's passing in 2005. The eldest of their 3 children, Christina Linklater, still runs the program. The structure remains relatively simple. John and Christina have recruited and trained young people as coaches in sports programs, putting them in positions of leadership and responsibility where they serve and mentor younger children. If the impact has been profound, however, it is due to a core emphasis not on athletics, but on the reciprocal nature of authentic leadership, drawing out and cultivating the best in oneself and in others in order to serve each other. Today, the evidence of its impact is everywhere. I just want to give you a few examples. So I was just up in Moose Factory in January, and meeting with a number of local organizations about doing a study of this youth program and traditional Cree leadership. So I met with the director of Moose Cree Health, who's a former leader in this program, of Moose Cree Education, who's also a former leader in the program, of Muskego Education, which is the larger regional organization for education, who's also a former leader, and who is succeeding 2 other former leaders in this program in that position. The director of Moose Cree Youth Services, also a former leader in the program. And that the Youth Services office is in the John R. Delaney Youth Center, so named after John Delaney at the request of youth. He received honorary band membership. When he received honorary band membership a number of years ago, more than 10 now, he passed away in 2005, there were about 25 Cree from Quebec who still remembered almost 40 years ago the impact that he had on their lives. So the director of the Ontario Cree Education Organization, former leader, the director of the Quebec, the Cree School Board of Quebec, had John Delaney as a teacher, and still refers to him as a model of what a teacher should be. So, these are just, they give you some idea of the impact that this one teacher had. Not because he placed emphasis on himself, but because he was somebody capable of drawing out the best in others. So, as somebody who went through that program myself, it wasn't just John and Grace, it was so many others, leaders in that program, that were mentors and role models for me as well. So, this program had the impact it had, really because, not because it filled a gap in Cree culture, but because it drew out the leadership capacity in predominantly Cree youth and tapped deeply into something, that's deep within Cree culture, that connects with our shared humanity. So reciprocity, magnanimity, solidarity, subsidiarity, human dignity, common good, pakotowing, walking on 2 legs. Just as traditional Cree stories are told about the consequences of Cree failures to live up to such ideals, so also do those of us who are Catholics, an appropriate emphasis in this context, so also do we who are to those of us who are Catholics need to understand and share stories of Catholic failures to live up to our own ideals. The same goes for all of us. As we do this, however, we must not lose sight of the many examples of people, Catholic, non-Catholic, religious, non-religious, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, who have modeled these ideals in their relationships and have modeled the struggles and efforts that such ideals require. A deep awareness of our shared humanity, of our shared capacity for high ideals, of the struggles it takes to live up to them, of our failures and successes in this regard, is the only solid foundation for the constant efforts that reconciliation requires, wherever the need for it arises, whatever the wrongs or divisions it needs to overcome.